I'm going to read from another book that was recommended by our master, many of our master teachers, but especially Dr. Asa G. Hilliard, Dr. Amos Wilson, many of our master teachers, okay, and they've recommended this book as giving us evidence of what our master teachers telling us, as knowing some of the qualities that are unique and peculiar to us. Self-knowledge requires us to inspect those components. What are those components? The socio-economic environment within which we live, the childhood experiences which we've had, or the economic aspect of ourselves. He's saying that self-knowledge requires us to inspect these components of ourselves and appreciate the role they have played in structuring the path that we are traveling. We must still remember our soul's journey, and that we are ultimately only a cell in a much broader tribal self. Our cell is unique and special, and it will determine how we interact with the larger world. But our self is more than just a cell. One of the cautions to prevent quote-unquote miseducation is to be familiar with the personal self and to know some of the qualities that are unique and peculiar to us as individuals. But we must understand those qualities as only a part of a bigger self, okay? So, in order to maybe discuss or to broaden or to highlight some of the qualities that are unique and peculiar to us as individuals, okay, but we must understand those qualities only as part of a bigger self, I'm going to read from another book that was recommended by our master, many of our master teachers, but especially Dr. Asa G. Hilliard, Dr. Amos Wilson, many of our master teachers, okay, and they've recommended this book as giving us evidence of what our master teachers telling us, as knowing some of the qualities that are unique and peculiar to us. And I'm going to be reading from a book entitled The Magical Child by I think he's a European author called Joseph Chilton Pearce. Okay, The Magical Child by Joseph Chilton Pearce. Any of you who are of African heritage and who has access to these books, please, as I always say, any book that I show on here should be part of every African conscious household. It should be part of every African household and should be part of every household in the future. If you have children or you are planning on having children, you should be reading some of these things, because as I say, the African self is unlike any other self on the face of the planet. So if you happen to have children of African heritage or with African heritage, it's important to know these things so that you can develop yourself, so that you can help to develop them as well. Okay, so why am I reading The Magical Child by Joseph Chilton Pearce? As I said, by Dr. Naim Agba, where he says that one of the cautions to prevent miseducation is to be familiar with the personal self and know some of the qualities that are unique and peculiar to us. Well, I want to prevent some miseducation. Okay, so let's read about the African self, and let's read what some scientists found when they went into Africa and observed some African children. And the reason I'm reading this is because I want you to see what the potential of African or people of African heritage is, okay, with regards to the natural developmental process that we all go through on the face of this planet. But these are Europeans who've gone into Africa and were observing African children and noticed that these African children were unlike any of the other children that they had looked at, okay? And you and I have the same potential. That's the point I'm trying to make here. I'm not trying to say that you have to be a Ugandan child or you have to be a child from those times. What I'm saying is within you and me is the potential for some of these things. And it's not just these things occur when we're infants, or as infants. These things occur as throughout our lifetimes, okay? But let me get into it. Let me read what this author is talking about. And I'm going to be reading from chapter 5 of this book, Magical Child by Joseph Chilton Pearce, entitled chapter 5, entitled The New Demonology Exercising Nature. And I'm going to be reading from page 38, where he talks about, as I said, the scientists going into Africa and observing children. So let me read. Meanwhile, in 1956, Marcel Gebert, under a research grant from the United Nations Children's Fund, traveled to Africa to study the effects of malnutrition on infant and child intelligence. She concentrated on Kenya and Uganda and made a momentous discovery. She found the most precocious, brilliant, and advanced infants and children ever observed anywhere. These infants had smiled continuously and rapturously from, at the latest, their 4th day of life. Blood analysis showed that all the adrenal steroids connected with the birth stress were totally absent by the 4th day after birth. Sensory motor learning and general development were phenomenal, indeed miraculous. These Ugandan infants were months ahead of American or European children. I'm going to say that again. These Ugandan infants were months ahead of American or European children. A superior intellectual development held for the first 4 years of life. And he puts into bracket, why it ended there will be a point of study in chapter 7. So in a later chapter, he goes into why it ends after 4 years. So basically, if we are going to go by what he's just said, that children of African heritage or Africans in general have a 4-year head start or have a head start on other children. Anyways, something to think about. These infants were born in the home, generally delivered by the mother herself. The child was never separated from the mother, who massaged, caressed, sang to, and fondled her infant continually. The mother carried her unswaddled infant in a sling next to her bare breasts continually. So the baby had a source of food, and the baby, I'm sure when you study the psychologically, there are psychological pros, okay, to why mother would do that, and I'm sure they will explain that to you if you ask them why do you do this. Of course, growing up in West Africa, many times I saw mothers carrying the babies on their backs. Breastfeeding was just a normal thing. But of course, anyways, let's just carry on reading. The mother carried her unswaddled infant in a sling next to her bare breast continually. She slept with her infant. The infant fed continuously according to its own schedule. These infants were awake a surprising amount of the time, alert, watchful, happy, calm. They virtually never cried. Now, their mothers were bonded to them, an issue I shall discuss more thoroughly in chapter 7. The mothers were bonded with or to them. Okay, I'm not sure about the children but he said they virtually never cried. He didn't say that they never cried. He said, I was going to say, well, really? No, the children cried. But anyways, they virtually never cried. Their mothers were bonded to them, into brackets, an issue I shall discuss more in chapter 7, and sensed their every need before that need had to be expressed by crying. The mother responded to the infant's every gesture and assisted the child in any and every move that was undertaken, so that every move initiated by the child ended in immediate success. At 2 days of age, 48 hours, these infants sat bolt upright, held only by their forearms, with a beautifully straight back and perfect head balance, their finely focused eyes staring intently, intelligently at their mothers, and they smiled and smiled. New European type hospitals were being erected in Uganda at the time of Gebert's studies. She, quote unquote, in brackets, she was granted an additional year to make long-term studies, to which I shall return in chapter 7. So he's going to discuss a lot of this in chapter 7. Only the upper class Ugandan families could afford such a luxury, of course, and the women of this class naturally follow the fashion of having their children in hospitals. These hospital-delivered infants, it turned out, followed the same civilized schedule American and European infants do. Jaber found that they did not smile until some 2.5 months after birth. 2.5 months after birth, okay? When did African children or the Ugandan children smile? They smiled continuously and rapturously from at least their 4th day of life. So the 4th day of life, the Ugandan infants and the Kenyan infants were smiling 4 days, okay, after being delivered. Whereas Jaber found that they did not smile until some 2.5 months after birth. 4 days, 2.5 months. Nor were they precocious in any sense. They showed no signs of sensory motor learning, displayed no uncanny intelligence for some 2.5 months, at which point some signs of intelligence were apparent. Blood analysis showed that high levels of adrenal steroids connected with birth stress were still prevalent at 2.5 months. Blood analysis showed that high levels of adrenal steroids connected with birth stress were still prevalent at 2.5 months. These infants slept massively, cried when awake, were irritable and colicky, frail and helpless. So the issue was not in some racial predisposition toward early intellectual growth. The issue lay solely with what happens to the newborn infant in hospitals. The Eurocentric approach versus the African-centered approach. The African-centered approach will have your babies getting rid of the adrenal steroids associated with birth stress, removed from the body at 4 days, whereas you will find children born in European style hospitals 2.5 months after. We're talking about approaches here: Eurocentric approach, African-centered approach. And he makes the point where he says this: so the issue was not in some racial predisposition toward early intellectual growth. The issue lay solely with what happens to the newborn infant in hospitals. What happens is quite simple. The infant is exposed to an intelligence determined to outwit nature, an intelligence distrustful of anything natural, an intelligence with a vast array of tools at its disposal with which to outwit and, in fact, supplant nature entirely. And in that outwitting and supplanting, damage is done that is incalculable. Future historians will shudder in loathing and horror at the hospital treatment of newborns and mothers in this very dark age of the medicine man and the surgeon, and the uses of chemicals and cuttings. The chemicals dull and stupefy both mother and infant, making birth hazardous, prolonged, difficult, and extreme. So tools are used for grappling, for crawling or clawing, sucking the infant out when the natural process have been made impossible. Should I read that again? What happens is quite simple. The infant is exposed to an intelligence determined to outwit nature, an intelligence distrustful of anything natural, an intelligence distrustful of anything natural, okay? An intelligence with a vast array of tools at its disposal with which to outwit and, in fact, supplant nature entirely. And in that outwitting and supplanting, damage is done that is incalculable. We cannot calculate how much damage is done if you use that approach. Chemicals dull and stupefy both mother and infant, making birth hazardous, prolonged, difficult, and extreme. So tools are used for grappling, clawing, sucking the infant out when the natural process has been made impossible. The Ugandan mother works around her house until some 5 minutes before delivery. In about an hour, she's out on the streets again, showing her newborn or her new infant to her neighbors and relatives. Frederick Leboyer was a conventional French obstetrician who delivered 9,000 babies by standard methods. By standard methods, I presume he's talking about Eurocentric standard methods. He noticed that France, a nation of 50 million persons, had over 1 million dysfunctional children. He began to question general birth practices and realized that hospital deliveries were damaging the infants. He quit his practice, retired to India for 3 years, where he carefully studied native procedures for child delivery in very remote so-called primitive areas. He combined what he saw with his own scientific background and came up with a synthesis. He returned to France and began a new form of delivering infants into the world. And the babies he delivers smile beautifully, continuously, rapturously from some 12 hours after birth. Okay, so this author is saying here that when you use, or when you've used the Eurocentric approach, you can see that they're not really the standard. Okay, so many of us who are, or who have been exposed to this approach, and he's talking about something that's quite intimate to us, and we're talking about the delivery of our infants, or the delivery of our children, us actually coming into this world. And he's saying that if you are someone who has been exposed or has been conditioned to this method, the Eurocentric method of child delivery into the world, comparing it to those quote unquote primitive methods, you will find that in fact the primitive methods that are more closer related to nature are better for those infants. Now, if you are someone from a, say, African heritage, or someone who is considered, whose heritage is quote unquote native or primitive, shouldn't we surely be using some of these methods? I'm not saying don't have children in hospital. That's not what I'm saying here. Every adult here, you should know what you need to do. I'm just using this as an example to show you the differences between the Eurocentric method, or the Eurocentric approach generally for things, versus a more prescriptive, self-defined approach, i.e. the African-centered approach, and the results that you could get based on those things. And this is all information about the personal self. So please, I hope that I managed to get the message across. Okay, as Africans, we do, yes, if the first point I made about African children who were able to get rid of adrenal steroids at sort of 4 days in, versus European children who could only get rid of it after 2.5 months, and saying that Africans had a natural head start. Well, let me just say that Africans who are steeped in the ethnocultural reality, or those who are steeped in their culture, or those who are able to find and implement their cultures, have better results, because those standards have been refined by the people who have come before them from the tribe or their group or the community or the nation. So they know how to handle themselves, and they know they've refined their methods over hundreds of thousands of years. Okay, so it makes no sense to go and follow someone else's method. Of course, that's not why the reason why we're in the position that we're in. It's not only because we just chose to go and follow these methods. Some of these methods were imposed upon us. So as we are awakening, we need to understand that we can also go back to these methods. We can go and find out how these methods were used, and we can then implement them into our life. So I will go back to Dr. Naeem Akbar in Know Thyself, and I will carry on reading so that we can drive the point home. Okay, thank you so much for taking time out of your precious day to watch my video. My name is Atu-kway. I am, and I do hope to be your African-centered tutor in the very near future. My area of interest is education, specifically speaking African-centered education, and my topic of interest is knowledge of self. Now, knowledge of self is represented behind me in the Baba framework. The Baba framework is a framework for the study of self. It was designed to be used as a tool to help build African organization and to break African bondage, and we do this by creating an environment where we can participate in whole systems thinking and to self-observe. When we're able to observe our actions, we can then begin to think and act as a nation or a tribe with a new level of clarity. And I hope that these videos are bringing you a new level of clarity, or at least driving home the point that before you do anything, get clarity first, and then you can start work. Okay, so